Hello, and welcome to my home office. As you can see, I'm stuck inside. I have not been able to metal detect for 3 months now, probably. It's winter in Minnesota, and the ground has frozen hard as granite. There will be no more detecting until it thaws out, probably mid-March or so. So, this being the off-season, it's the time when I pull out my best finds, figure out how I want to display them. I go through my trash, separate it, and get it off to a scrapper so it can be recycled. And also, I do research on places where I want to detect when I finally can again. You know, one of the things that I hear from people who are just starting out metal detecting is they want to know how to find the old things. Maybe they're a little bored with digging clad at parks and schools and so on, and they want to find artifacts. So the answer to that is simply, to find artifacts, you go where people were 100, 200, 300 years ago. Now, some of those places are obvious because the buildings are still standing. But unfortunately, since there have been metal detectors for the last 50 years or more, a lot of those places have been gone over pretty good, and they may not be all that productive. So I like to go where I know people were, but there's no standing evidence of that right now. And to do that, you do the research. I'm going to show you how to use plat maps to find where people used to live. Now, a plat map is simply a map that shows you property lines. There were plat maps 150 years ago, just as there are plat maps now. So I'm going to show you one source where you can find old plats and get you started on how to find some sites to detect.
Old as dirt.
One of the places where you can find old plat maps is at the David Rumsey Map Collection, and I will put this link in the description for you. This site has just thousands and thousands of old maps, and it's really fun to browse through them. But for detecting, we need to focus. So the first thing you need to do is decide what state do you want to detect in and what county. Typically, plat maps are organized by county. So let's say we want to look in Wisconsin, and we'll just see what's available. So we're going to say the name of the state, Wisconsin, and then add the word plat to make sure we get the right kind of map. So we're taken to the results here where we can see thumbnails of what's available. Now, I can tell by looking at this thumbnail right here that this is the front and back covers of a plat book. This happens to be the St. Croix County plat book from 1897. And the very next thumbnail would then be the frontispiece showing the publisher, published by Pinckney and Brown in 1897. I love this old typography in these plat books. The next page would be a text table of contents, which would list the townships, the cities, and villages. Now, in the United States, the governmental units would be state, then county, and then the next one down would be township. And that's how the plats are also organized in these books. There are separate pages for cities and villages where you can get more detail, and I will explain that a little bit later. And then the very next spread that you typically see in these plat books is kind of a visual representation of the table of contents. Each one of these sections that it's outlined by this green border is a township. So let's zoom in, for example, on this one here. Erin Township, as you see here, is pretty typical of the townships that we find in the Midwest, where it's basically square. It's a square that contains squares. Each one of these little squares is called a section, and they are numbered starting at the top right, and then they move left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then straight down to 7, and then back toward the right. So let's go back to the thumbnails. What follows the visual table of contents or the index that we just saw are pages where each page is a township, a full township. So let's look at this one here. This is Ceylon Township. So now we can see the entire township. Let's zoom in on section number 1 here in the northeast corner. Now each of these sections are divided into different properties, at least in this one section here. And these names that you see, that's the name of the owner. So this large property with 286.04 acres is owned by the Willow River Lumber Company. Charles Reed has 84.06 acres. W.R. Hill owns 40 acres, and so on. Now, the only person who is actually living on the property, though, is D. Christensen. And we know that because of this black square. On plat maps, the black squares represent houses or residences. This is really key information because here in the U.S., we really need to focus our searches, our detecting, where we know people were, where they gathered, or where they had a lot of activity. It's really not very productive if you just walk onto a field and expect to find something unless we know that there were people there. So that's why these squares and these other symbols I'm going to show you are so important. It tells us where people were. So moving off to the west a little bit more, we see a railroad. This is the St. Paul, Minneapolis, Omaha Railroad, cutting through here diagonally. And here's a river. The squiggly line is a river, the Black Brook, sorry. And roads are indicated by these double lines. You see this road, and it does a jog here where it crosses the railroad track and then continues on, then shoots off to the south. Another interesting mark on this particular plat map is this brickyard. It's indicated by this tic-tac-toe mark right there. Now, this brickyard is on the same property owned by this Amundsen character, and we assume that Amundsen had something to do with the brickyard because his house was right here. Moving on to show you a few other symbols. There are schools marked with a building. I can't zoom in anymore on that one, but you can see kind of a house-looking building. Here's a cemetery marked with a cross. And then here is a church, and these are pretty obvious because they have a steeple and a cross. You will also find on other maps indications for stores. Sometimes you'll see a building for a store. Other times it'll just say the word store. Often there will be a building for a town hall. You'll also frequently see a mark for a blacksmith shop, and that is not always a square. Sometimes it's just the initials BSS. So keep an eye out for those as well. Just something to point out also, you'll see these arrows, like these diagonal arrows, kind of linking two pieces of property. That just means that this property here, this 40 acres, also belongs to this Peter Utgard, who owns the rest of this property here to the north and northeast. One thing I like to do is to kind of follow the railroads to see if there were houses close by. Like here's a house that was very, very near the railroad. Sometimes that could serve as a kind of impromptu station. And other times, you know, sometimes they would have dairy farms where the railroad would stop twice a day and pick up and drop off milk cans. So there would be activity there. Now these shaded areas that you see indicate towns. You can find the detail for that town if you go back to the thumbnails and just look for, let me see if I can get there without too much trouble here. Look for the towns that are indicated. For example, here's Deer Park. That's another town within Ceylon. So you can zoom in and get more detail on the towns that are just shaded on the township level maps. So getting back to Ceylon, let's take another peek around because there were some other interesting things. I saw a creamery here. That would be another area where activity would have taken place. Here's a Catholic church that's marked not with a steeple, but just with a black square. So you really want to pore over these and see if you could find centers of activity. There's another school, and so on. By now you may be saying, well, this is all very interesting, but how do I translate what I see on an 1897 plat map to something I can use today? Well, here is one of the best features of the David Rumsey map collection, and that is the Geo-referencer. Basically, these plat maps have been aligned to modern day maps with geo-referencing. And I will show you what you can do with that. You click on this orange button here at the top of the screen, and then you will see this 1897 plat map aligned, geographically aligned with a road map underneath it, okay? And you can zoom both in at the same time and so on. Now, you will find it more helpful if you go to the far left margin of the browser window. There's a globe icon, and that gets you to your base maps. Click that and then choose Satellite Map, and now you have all the topography from today's satellite images underneath the plat map, okay? Now let's go back to some of these features that we saw on the plat, and let's look at what's there now, okay? And the way to do that is to go up here to the top right-hand corner, and you take the slider and you move it to the left, and you can see that opacity start to change. We can make that plat map fade so that we can see the satellite imagery underneath. Let's go over here to this railroad and take a look. What's interesting is the railroad is gone. The tracks are gone, but you can still very clearly see where it used to be. You can see the railroad bed. That raised area where they had the tracks is still there, even though the tracks are no longer being used. Also, interestingly, this brickyard, there is nothing there now either. Now, there is a reason, I assume, that this big plowed area, this big farm field has gone, they're not plowing and using this area in here. So I suspect this is actually where the brickyard was. Maybe it's excavated or something and they can't farm it. And that the marker is just a little bit off. But I would still, look, I would want to look around in there. There were guys working, having lunch, interacting. There's probably artifacts to be found related to the brickyard. And of course, there's the house here. We assume it was the owner or the foreman for the brickyard. So this would be a very good potential place to detect. I should have mentioned that I like detecting places where there is no house. Instead of detecting yards, I like to detect where there used to be a house. And so farm fields are pretty attractive to me for that reason. Moving along, let's see what else we can see. Oh, I wanted to point out these two markers. Now, what we see are markers on the 1897 map here, which is very close to a modern-day farm just north of it, right? We have the same situation across the road where we have a marker for a residence here, and yet there is a house currently just north of it. Now, I would look at this situation with a bit of skepticism. When someone built a house, they typically did not build a new house very far away from this. And that's because they would have already drilled a well. Maybe they had outbuildings they wanted to continue to use in a new house. So very often they would build a new house on top of the old house. So if this property is old, this property that shows on the O.M. Hanson 1897 plat map, if this is an old property, I would expect that this marker really should have been right there, and then that it was just misaligned a little bit when they made the map. Same situation over here. You can, if you're, ambitious, see if you can find any information on these houses and this property to see if they do date back to 1897. It's possible that this is a newer house and this house was just never overbuilt. But because I would have typically better potential sites, I would make this a lower priority for myself. For example, I would look for a site that has no such conflict, right? No such questions around it. For example, this Hahn right here, these 40 acres. Now, there's a marker there in 1897, but when you bring the opacity down, there's no house around it. And so I would have much more confidence that this is truly an extinct property and not a mirage, to put it that way. And further proof of that is when you look at this next marker to the north, this current day farm is exactly where this marker is for this F. Arndt property. So I'm going to say that this marker is a farm or a house that is no longer in existence, and make that a high priority place that I would want to look into. Now, if you recall, there was a church down here. Let me find it. Right here. And look what happens when we reduce the opacity. There's nothing there now. There is a stand of trees, it looks like, but I don't see a building in there. There's a reason why the farmer gives this a wide margin when he's plowing, that there was probably a building in there one time. Maybe there's foundation stones. Maybe this little section is even owned by someone else. Maybe it's still owned by the church property. But the fact that there's no church there makes this attractive to me. Churches were very busy activity centers, and you will find artifacts at a church site. So that would be another area that I would be very interested in looking at. So looking also at other symbols, here we have a cemetery. Now, what's interesting about cemeteries is that once they put in a cemetery, they didn't move it. So cemeteries that you see on old plat maps are usually still there. And it's a good way to orient if you're aligning an old map and you don't have this, this feature, for example. If you can put the cemetery, the old cemetery on top of the new cemetery, you know that you've got it aligned. Sometimes for sawmills, you'll see a little jagged saw blade. Also, I've seen for flour mills, they'll use a water wheel icon. So just look all over the map for interesting places, for houses that may no longer exist, and use that transparency feature to find places that are completely extinct, not lived in, and maybe just a farm field that they wouldn't mind you digging in. So now you've identified a few places that you want to detect. You still need to get permission for this. Please do not assume because I've pointed these out that I'm suggesting you detect these particular places. The fact that they're in my video, they may be in high demand. You may not be the first, and we don't want to, be bugging property owners. I really just wanted to show you how this was done so you can find your own townships, your own sites using these techniques. In terms of getting permission, how do you do that? Well, you need to find that location on a current modern day map. So let's go back to the base maps and just look at this street map. So, let's say you want to detect, let's go back to this, let's go back to Ehon, okay? Let's say you want to detect Ehon. You know that this property is right next to this road. So mark that, get that street, write that street down, note where it is in the section. So this is in the northeast quadrant of section 5, okay? Then you need to go to your county property database and click around on it until you find out who owns that section of property where you want to detect. Every county will have a property database, but not every county makes it easy to find the owner of that particular piece of property. It'll vary. But if you don't mind spending $30, $35 a year, this app called Onyx Hunt has all of this county GIS information in the app. And you can go right to that spot in the app and it will show you who the property owner is. So then you can just go there and get permission and start detecting. Well, I hope that was helpful for you. If you find an old site and you dig your first artifact, I would love to hear about it. So drop me a comment. Otherwise, make sure to like, subscribe, all that stuff, so you can continue to see my videos when I finally am able to get another one out. And I hope that's soon. So take care until then.
Old as dirt.